So, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, dependent on where you are. Welcome to this webinar. My name is Jan Raad. I'm with the University of Amsterdam and the University of Rotterdam, but I'm also here as the chair of Metropolis International. This is part of a series of webinars that we've been organizing on issues related to migration and diversity. And we see it as our purpose to bring different constituencies together, academic researchers, policymakers, people from the NGO world, people from the business community, to talk about issues related to international migration and population diversity integration in a way that works. So what we really try to do is connect these communities and also encourage them to exchange ideas and expertise so that the policies that are applied, that they are better and that they work to the advantage of both the sending and the host countries and the migrants themselves. So today's topic is smuggling, or actually the perverse effects of smuggling, or the perverse effects of the various policies dealing with smuggling. We've lined up a number of fine speakers, and a discussion will be introduced and led by Dr. Howard Duncan, who's with Carleton University in Ottawa and the previous chair of Metropolis International. So Howard, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jan. I want to first of all convey my thanks to you and to Metropolis for hosting this seminar. And I would also like to thank my co-organizer, Gabriela Sanchez, who has been instrumental in putting this together, and including by recruiting the other speakers who I'm very excited to hear from. So, as Jan mentioned, the general theme today is the seemingly intractable problem of irregular migration, which is a problem that has existed for decades and about which no one, and certainly no government now, has a solution. The stories of irregular migration have grown more sensational over time, with an emphasis on overloaded, leaky boats and drownings, migrants dying in the deserts along the US-Mexico border, organ harvesting in the Sinai Peninsula, and migrants frozen to death lying in empty landscapes along the Canada-US border. Featured in many contemporary accounts of irregular migration is the smuggler, who is now portrayed usually as the sinister and dangerous force behind irregular migration, and now often is the principal target of efforts to contain this form of migration. Portrayals of irregular migration are now often cast as a battle between the forces of evil, namely the smuggler, and forces of good, namely law enforcement. Raising the stakes yet higher, the smuggler is now often seen as an agent of organized crime, making the struggle all the more urgent. Without denying the tragedies that can accompany migrant smuggling, this webinar will add nuance to the singular portrayal of the migrant smuggler as a scourge to be eliminated in the fight against irregular migration. The realities on the ground are far more complex than this, and complex in ways that this emphasis on the smuggler as a force of evil can bring its own risks and harms to the migrants whose well-being we all wish to protect. So we have three exciting speakers today, and I'm very pleased to be able to introduce them to you. Our first speaker will be Hara Arush, who is a PhD candidate at the School of Sociology and Social Policy of the University of Leeds. She is currently finishing her dissertation, where she examines the trajectories of West and Central African migrants moving through cities in North Africa, with a specific focus on the case of Oman and Tamanrasset in Algeria. As an ethnographer, Hara's work examines how migrants' trajectories are governed, facilitated, and shaped by state controls, but also through the tensions present in community building. She is the author of Migration Governance in Algeria, Challenges, Interests, and Future Prospects, and co-author of the policy study, Current Trends and Challenges on the Facilitation of Irregular Migration in Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco, both published by Euromesco. Her areas of interest are mobility processes, migration facilitation, irregular migration, and migration governance. Our second speaker will be Lina Vasiliute, who is a research fellow at the Brussels-based think tank, the Center for European Policy Studies, which leads the European Union policy debate. At the Justice and Home Affairs Unit, Lina focuses on the topical issue of the criminalization of solidarity and the impacts of migrant smuggling policies among broader migration and asylum, criminal justice, and fundamental rights issues. Lina has co-authored a book on policing humanitarianism, among her other publications on the topic of this webinar. Lina has acted as a peer reviewer for the editorial board of Oxford University Press, the International Studies Perspectives Journal, and is on the executive board of the McGill Journal of Sustainable Development Law and the International Journal of Migration and Border Studies. During 10 years of professional experience, Lina has conducted research and advocacy for public institutions, foundations, and NGOs in Lithuania, Malta, Hungary, Belgium, the Netherlands, and South Africa. And I like this final point. In 2018, Lina was ranked among the 100 women of Lithuania that all Lithuanians worldwide are proud of. Very nice. Our final speaker is Dr. Gabriela Sanchez. Trained as a socio-cultural anthropologist with a background in law enforcement, Gabriela Sanchez conducts comparative work on border control, migration enforcement, mobility-related crimes, and she has written extensively about the dynamics of migrant smuggling on the US-Mexico border, the Americas, and North Africa, with a special emphasis on the everyday lives of the people who facilitate migrants' journeys. She is currently field director for a US State Department-funded study on migration in Tunisia at the University of Massachusetts, Lowell. Gabriela is, in my view, a giant in this field and has been an inspiration to a great many of us who are thinking about these issues. With that introduction, I would now like to turn the microphone over to you, Hara.
Thank you so much, Howard. Thank you so much for having me with you today and for the introduction. Let me just quickly share slide. Can you see the slide?
Yes, just fine.
Yeah. So what you see here, actually, I wanted to start from this point to give you an idea about Algeria's approach to irregular migration. This wall has been built recently within the coast, the west coast of Algeria, particularly in the city of Oran, one of the most interesting cities and the main departure point of irregular migration of our Algerian national irregular migrants. So the local authorities decided to build the wall to prevent irregular migration and to prevent access to the networks facilitating irregular migration. So I wanted to start with this to show you how the phenomenon of irregular migration is managed in Algeria through a very ad hoc approach. overlooking the main drivers of clandestine migration, such as the devastating socioeconomic conditions and political conditions currently in Algeria. So before I want to ask the question that what do we really know about Algeria's migration policies and particularly smuggling policies? Algeria is increasingly a significant point of departure for irregular migration and what I as well consider as a deviant destination for Western and Central African migrants. When we talk about Western Central African irregular migrants, Algeria found its comfort in the illusion of transit migration. Transit migration has become an illusionary and convenient framework to deal with the movement and presence of sub-Saharan migrants on the Algerian territory. Under the guise of a transit migration, the Algerian government deployed at the first stage a laissez-aller approach, as it's not totally concerned with irregular migration. However, this presumed transitory flow of migrants has gradually morphed into something more permanent. So the migrants' stay within the Algerian space was prolonged further and evolved into patterns of settlement. And this shift has been remarkably a consequence of the EU's externalization of migration policies in the Mediterranean region, as well as the Sahel region. So as the EU efforts invested in North African countries to prevent and contain the movement of the migrants, this shifted and reconfigured the position of Algeria and the dynamics of migration in the region. So even though Algeria did not engage in any agreement with the European Union, but they eventually shaped and re-embedded Algeria within the same EU project of migration governance, where the main arsenal policies is in criminalization of irregular migration and secularization. So they introduced a law that it criminalizes the entry and exit from the country of its national citizens and foreign citizens too, and introducing fines and incarceration as well. When concerning smuggling, particularly smuggling, Algeria is an original signatory of the Palermo Protocol against the smuggling of migrants by land, air, and sea, which has been ratified in 2004. The country typified the smuggling as criminal offense, as to arrange an illegal exit from the national territory for one or several persons to obtain directly or indirectly financial benefits or any other benefits. So the law also establishes imprisonment from 3 to 5 years and a fine from 300,000 to 500,000 Algerian dinars as punishment upon those involved in facilitation of irregular migration. While Algeria's definition of smuggling is in line with the smuggling protocol in incorporating the financial or other benefits component, the law penalizes only the act of exiting the Algerian territory, different from the Article 3, Paragraph A of the protocol, which defines the smuggling as illegal entry of the person into a state party. In addition, the scope of the penal code is very ambiguous and does not delineate clearly how the financial profit would be proved in the process of arranging the exit from the country. A remarkable shift now emerged within the policy discourse in Algeria, the discourse that links irregular migration to and from Algeria to transnational criminal networks as the main driver behind irregular migration, which is relatively new. It was first introduced by the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Abdelkader Sahel, who labeled the migrants as a threat to the national security, whose massive flows in Algeria were the result of the activities of highly organized networks that maintain and facilitate this kind of human trafficking. And now eventually, the smugglers have become the one to blame to blame for the peril and vulnerabilities the migrant experienced during the journey. And this way, disregarding and blurring the main driving factors for the reliance at the first place on smuggling services, such as the lack of legal possibilities to migration and asylum. And this seems actually the new direction that Algeria is heading towards. So according to the recent declarations of the Minister of Justice that announced they are preparing for 2 new legislations that again reinforces the criminalization regarding drug, human trafficking, and smuggling following the surge in clandestine migration. So what are the implications and the effects of these policies on the migrants, whether Western and Central African migrant or irregular Algerian migrants? The Algerian authorities have introduced this opaque mode of containment that produces temporal and spatial implications for the migrants considered as exploitative disposable working force. So the rationalization and criminalization approach legitimizes the process of dispersal and constant destabilization of migrants' movement and presence within the Algerian territory. And this approach, as I explained before, has been publicly justified as a policy to fight transnational criminal networks of smuggling and trafficking that threaten national security and public order. Ultimately, as an attempt to fight these criminal networks, this has been framed as a form of protection for those individuals and the national security and the fight against criminal networks. So now being an irregular migrant in Algeria translates into an indeterminate stay where they face increasingly collective expulsions, arrests, detention that do not meet the basic humanitarian standards. Now, this approach, is it really effective in terms of deterring irregular migration or smuggling? This approach actually fails to curb irregular migration and migrant smuggling. It rather leads the migrant to rely more on the smugglers or to engage independently upon the knowledge of navigating the space or the territory of Algeria they have built during their stay in the country. Sometimes they don't have to rely on the smugglers, they engage independently on moving or coming back to Algeria after being expelled to the southern part of Algeria. Whereas others, they have to seek the support and help of the smugglers, but at the same time, they have to navigate a very complex socioeconomic infrastructure that facilitates their movement. And at the same time, it also reproduces vulnerabilities and exploitation. Another point concerning the Algerian national irregular migrant is Algerian nationals face increasingly difficulties to access legal pathways to migration. So they don't engage in irregular migration just like that. So they attempted several times to apply for visas, but their visas are systematically denied. And the EU's visa facilitation agreements remain less satisfying for them. And this has in part led to an increase to irregular departures from Algeria towards Spain and Italy. And this particular rejections in the visas, it's actually in retaliation to Algeria's lack of engagement in bilateral agreements with the EU. Some EU member states have pressed for more conditionality in relations. And the example of France's recent declaration to significantly reduce the quotas of the visas for North African countries because Algeria did not want to sign any readmission agreements for the irregular migrants in France. So France decided to reduce the quotas for the visas. And this is actually a very threatening approach that is likely to further complicate and prevent Algeria from engaging in any partnership regarding irregular migration governance. So I wanted to give you like an overall picture about the current dynamic policies and how Algeria is actually approaching irregular migration.
Okay, thank you very much, Hara. Fascinating and complex story that you're telling, and of course there's a lot of details that you didn't have time to go into, but you know, I hope that you managed to publish some of this work. And one thing that particularly intrigued me is towards the end of your presentation, where you described the foreign policy aspects of the fight against irregular migration. These things, I mean, there's the old saying of, or the old concern about the unintended consequences of policy. And we're seeing this right now in the Algerian case. So thank you very much. Lena, can I offer the microphone to you now?
Thank you so much, Howard. Thank you, Jan, Gabriela, and Kira for convening this event today, this webinar. And it's really my pleasure to present a work actually by both Kira and Gabriela has been involved in, and let me just find my presentation. Because we wrote together with Kira and our also external collaborator Andrew Falone, and also with a lot of support from Gabriela about inconvenient evidence and politics in the area of migration management and migrant smuggling, and the EU's approach to this field, to migrant smuggling, and ongoing challenges that have been also highlighted by Kira, and the EU's power basically transporting its own norms, legal regimes into the countries of transit or buffer zones, if you wish, as to preclude spontaneous arrivals of asylum seekers, other migrants, as well as to preclude solidarity with them, and to preclude the testimonies and democratic accountability by those who witness how state is actually abandoning its own international obligations under international law. From, for instance, we saw how the migrant smuggling related crimes actually have been invoked, or accusations towards such actions have been invoked towards civil society actors who have been witnessing illegal pushbacks or pullbacks perpetrated by the public authorities. So I would like to emphasize a bit area of EU and narratives and policies and laws at the EU level, since it's not considered
a technical problem. Jan, are you able to bring Lena back?
No, I'm not, because I think she is just talking and unaware that it's interrupted. So maybe it's better to continue with Gabriela. In the meantime, I will try to contact Lena.
Okay, well, maybe I could, if Lena can hear us. Lena, are you able to hear us? Because we have lost you. Okay, this is unfortunate. Gabriela, are you able to step in now?
Of course, not a problem. Let's go ahead and do it while she reconnects.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thanks to all of you for being with us this morning. And thank you so much to Howard, because he was the one who first approached me with the idea. So I'm blaming it on you. It was you, the one who, I think that there's certainly a lot of concern. I think that we are all together. All of us come together but this real legitimate concern about the safety of migrants, but also the recognition that the persona of the smuggling facilitator exists as a result of enforcement. So trying to understand and to map, what this means, how this is actually experienced on the ground, I think is something that also brings all of us together today and hopefully for a very long time. What I want to talk about today was, kind of shifting regions, moving to the context in the Americas and some of the work that I have been doing more recently. And here, what I am going to be speaking about is, also kind of connected to what some of the comments that Hara was making in terms of this stepped up level of enforcement, what we are witnessing on the ground. Because in the Americas, and this also, by this I'm also including, the Caribbean, because many times we just think, with the Americas, the US-Mexico border in Mexico. And here also in the context of the Caribbean, we have seen over the last few years, this has stepped up attempts to counter not only irregular migration, but also to fight migrant smuggling. Many times this is kind of like an interchangeable conversation, that they are used interchangeably. But this is something that we have seen across throughout the hemisphere, how governments are pretty much involved now, not only on what is happening within their own borders, but they are also involved in processes, especially in the case of the United States, of externalization. But also we see these connections and interactions among countries in the Americas, trying to detain and contain the movement of migrants as they try to go through different places and through different routes. And I think this is really quick, it's very important to highlight the fact that not all migrants who travel in the Americas want to reach the United States or Canada. Many of them are trying to reach South America, other countries in Central America. Mexico is also becoming a country of destination for many of the people who cannot many times reach the US or who decide not to reach North America. But all of these efforts to counter migration, but also to fight migrant smuggling have resulted in what is now unknown, because we don't really have an exact count, but definitely a very visible enforcement. We see how law enforcement agencies are taking advantage of social media and are taking every opportunity that they have to post videos or pictures of these captures, many times label them as rescues of migrants, in different contexts, in the sea, along the US-Mexico border, the Guatemala-Mexico border, the Darien, and the region that connects Central America with South America. And this is certainly, all of these operations have certainly translated into an increase in the numbers of apprehensions of migrants traveling irregularly. We have seen the official numbers. But on the other hand, we know very little again, about the facilitators of this movement. We see in all of these representations, all of these images, a very clear indication, very strong indication that there's growing numbers of people who are being apprehended, but we don't know who they are. And what is very troubling, we don't know what happens to them after they have been apprehended. And something that numbers at the global level show is that the numbers of people who are being apprehended for both migrant smuggling and human trafficking are definitely increasing. But hardly any of those cases ever make it to the conviction stage. So what appears to happen or to occur at this moment is that enforcement is leading us to, or leading law enforcement, or the pressure to enforce is leading law enforcement agencies to apprehend or arrest growing numbers of people. But many of them fall into this kind of legal limbo because many of the countries in which they are apprehended don't have the infrastructure or also the judges or they don't have the judiciary to carry out these processes. So it's very likely that a lot of those people who are being apprehended for facilitating irregular migration or also for migrant smuggling are just in detention facilities across the continent without a very clear awareness of what is happening to them or where they stand in terms of their processes. And today, the specific case that I wanted to talk about, and this is something that was very covered by Mexican media over the last month or so, is the case of Juana Alonso. Juana Alonso is an indigenous woman from Guatemala who 7 years ago decided to come to the United States. And in the process, she of arranging her crossing with a smuggling facilitator, she accepted, or we don't know the exact circumstances, but she started to work at the house of the smuggling facilitator in a border state on the Mexican side of the border. Two migrants who were staying at this house were able to escape, and they reported the location of the safe house, this location where the smugglers tend to keep the migrants before they cross the border. They reported this to the police, and in the process, the migrants stated that Juana was the person who had kept them captive at this specific location. Juana did not speak Spanish at the time. She only spoke her indigenous language. And she was apprehended, she was tortured, she was forced to sign a statement that she had in fact engaged in kidnapping. And she was judged without the presence of an interpreter. And she was convicted, she was sentenced to prison. After 7 years, the Mexican Commission for Human Rights, and also through the pressure of several NGOs, the case was brought to court. And only over, following months of campaigning by NGOs and by Juana's family, the court decided to grant her an amnesty, given the fact that she had been convicted, that there had been several, to call them irregularities, to call them somehow, during her process. This is only one case that we know of, but also the evidence that we have been able to collect in terms of counter-smuggling point out to the fact that most operations are actually taking place within these communities, indigenous communities that are inhabited by people who have been displaced by civil war and also by conflict and by the activities of other organized criminal factions. So to conclude, I think it's going to be very important for all of us that any kind of engagement or any consideration that we pay to either the engagements, the way we approach smuggling, but also the way in which we speak about counter-smuggling has to bring into the conversation issues that are related to race, class, and specifically in the case of the Americas, the notion of the rights of people from Indigenous communities. I've been part of several conversations over the last few weeks of people who tell me that it's not important to speak about the Indigenous communities, that it is not important to bring interpreters to court, that it doesn't matter to protect or to give access to justice to people who are being prosecuted for migrant smuggling if they cannot speak Spanish. So it's going to be, when courts are only habilitated to be carried out in Spanish. So it's going to be very important, for all of us, regardless of what setting, what country, what region we're in, to keep this in mind, to see how, once again, race, class, and gender become intersected and create the conditions for vulnerability and also for violence against migrants. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gabriela. A tragic story that you have related to us that illustrates, I suppose, a number of things, not just the, perhaps we could call it the incompetence of law enforcement in many countries, but indicates how the concern, which is now, of course, a global concern. We've seen it in the expressed in the UN's Global Compact on Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, how the amplification of the smuggling and irregular migration issue can lead to harms generated against people who either are migrants moving irregularly or who are serving as facilitators, or as we often call them, smugglers. And I think it's important that you use the term facilitator as well as the term smuggler, because using the term smuggler brings its own connotations. It raises the stakes in this conversation. Anyway, Gabriela, thank you very much for that. I think that we have Lena back. But before I turn to Lena, I just want to mention to the people participating in the audience today that we would prefer that you submit your questions using the chat function. And if you are unable to, for some reason, to use the chat function to raise a question, one thing that you could do is a signal to Jan Roth that you would like to raise a question verbally, but our preference is that you put the questions in the chat. Lena, do we have you back?
Yes, I am here. I managed to somehow rejoin magically only through my mobile phone, so
Oh, wow.
I hope you hear me well.
We do.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you are able to pick up from where you left off. I think we all remember where you were, but or if you'd like to just summarize quickly what you have already said and then finish your presentation, that would be great.
Okay, so thank you so much, and apologies everyone for such a technological issue, but it happens as we live in this more virtual space. So I started to introduce the narratives in the EU that surrounded the new EU's action plan on migrant smuggling for the years to come. So basically, Ylva Johansson herself stated that I want to help fight migrant smugglers, organized criminals exploiting the dreams of a better life for financial gain, and who are bringing suffering, death in the high seas and highways of Europe. So we see that very much as in Hara's presentation and in Gabriela's one, that in the EU there is this also narrative of this unscrupulous smuggler who is just exploiting the migrants and refugees, and they are seen as agents, less and passive in this story. However, from empiric research, we very much see that often these people are the facilitators of their journeys, sometimes of their dreams, sometimes they are family members and friends and do not take any money. Other times these are civil society organizations, but when they happen to be other migrants and refugees, as Gabriela has connected with this intersectionality debate, then they are getting even heightened penalties. And maybe very illustrative example, the recent story from Greece, prosecution of 3 Syrian men, where the penalties amounted to 18, because 18 people have been drowned in this during these trips, where these Syrian men, asylum seekers themselves, for the discounted rate, agreed to kind of steer the boat. Got the penalties of 18 life sentences, so of 439 years. In the end, the prosecution, people were acquitted. However, these very hefty and heavy penalties that sometimes, are not accompanied for homicides itself, showing how politicized this issue became. So within EU's law, and on the other hand, we have very vague definition on what is crime of migrant smuggling, or in EU's case, facilitation. And as you highlighted the difference between smuggling and facilitation, EU is actually kind of blurring and criminalizing the very fact of facilitation. So the key definition is any intentional assistance to enter or transit across the EU, and it's basically not requiring material or other financial benefit motive, and it's not in line with the UN Migrant Smuggling Protocol, nor UN Global Compact on Migration, Objective 9. So across the EU, we witnessed maybe this increased emergence of misuses of this law because it's so easy to use. Any intentional assistance can be brought before the courts, except for 4 countries, and Germany, Ireland, Luxembourg, and Portugal. These countries are actually requiring some sort of financial or material benefit to start the prosecution. So we have this very vague definition on the one hand, and very hefty penalties on the other hand. And so we have also assistance to reside. Here are also a number of issues. It's not clear when there is facilitation of residence, transit, and entry, that both categories can be often blurred. And also we have only like optional exemption from criminalization. Basically what EU law says, or facilitation directive says, any member state may decide not to impose sanctions with regard to the behavior defined as facilitation of migrant smuggling if it's deemed to be humanitarian assistance. Then we actually also with Gabriela Sanchez and other colleagues, we worked on studies for the European Parliament study to see whether this legal act is fit for purpose or not. We concluded that it's not fit for purpose. However, Commission had a very difficult time to decide to revise it or to reopen facilitation directive for legal recast, and instead issued some sort of guidance on implementing facilitation directive, which has only exempted acts mandated by law, meaning search and rescue operations. However, through the other guidance, those search and rescue organizations are subjected to obligatory cooperation with the authorities. And we ended up with a kind of interesting situation where European Commission basically put before the Court of Justice in the EU in Luxembourg Hungary, or accused Hungary of basically criminalizing information, legal assistance for asylum seekers. This was one of Stop the Soros campaign's flagship initiatives by government in Hungary. And Commission started infringement proceeding, basically arguing that this is in violation with EU's asylum law. Hungary, on the other hand, defended that they had the right to criminalize such assistance, arguing on the basis of facilitation directive. So here we see how the government, Hungarian government, basically misused this law basically towards the Commission itself. And here is what the scholars and the civil society have been saying. Moreover, the law is broader than that, because even the instigation, accomplice, attempts to commit can also be regarded as a crime. So it opens many doors for misuses. And it's not by coincidence that at the moment, we know that both UN Special Rapporteur on Migrant Rights, as well as UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, are looking into the issue on why there are so many human rights defenders, either those who are monitoring the situation at the borders, or those helping migrants and refugees, and especially migrants and refugees themselves, being so often accused of being facilitators. And yeah, as I mentioned, of very hefty penalties. I had a slide basically indicating how in France you can get from 5 years to 30,000 fine of imprisonments without any profit, only for facilitation of entry or transit. In Greece, this is 10 years or at least 20,000 for one person, and then aggravation goes and the number of years increases. And yeah, in Italy from 1 to 5 years, and with a fine of 15,000 for each person. Yeah, and the fines usually goes for each person transported. Then if we add to this complexity the EU sanctions directive that preclude actually airlines and other travel agencies to legal service providers, basically to provide service for refugees and migrants to board, then we see that actually these sort of laws really preclude the mobility of, or the attempt is to preclude the mobility of migrants and refugees, and especially targeting spontaneous arrivals of asylum seekers. So we also looked at the very interesting dynamics on investigations, and how at EU level the agencies are framing the issue. So for instance, Europol said that in 2020, impact resulted in 2,110 international investigations and 2,280 arrests, of which, however, only 16 high-value targets. So, and in identification of 26 and then dismantling 14 criminal networks. However, it seems like 16 high-value targets and then more than 2,000 investigations and more than 2,000 arrests do not add up. There is a question what the law enforcement has been targeting, because there seems to be some wrong targets or misses in their investigations. We have been further concerned about leaked documents to journalists, where it has been announced that more than 1,400 anti-smuggling prosecutions there is a target at the EU level of 1,400 prosecutions. So here again, there is a question you know, how those prosecutions are happening and what are political and policy design and mechanisms behind it. Then recent with EU-Belarus crisis, the recent invention of state-sponsored smuggling, as if this phenomenon was somehow different from EU-Turkey, EU-Morocco, EU-Libya cooperation preceding, preceding the EU-Belarus situation. So what we see, unfortunately, among when law enforcement has too wide discretion and margins to prosecute any intentional assistance, who gets targeted. And as Gabriela already highlighted, these are often smuggled migrants themselves, their family members and friends, communities in the transit countries providing vital services, civil society actors, volunteers and citizens, as well journalists who often provide democratic accountability of what's happening at the borders or uphold rights of those migrants. Also some facilitators who sometimes or profit from migrants. And the very tiny part of it, there might be, or there are transnational organized criminal groups involved, but that they are really dropped in this arena of other actors being routinely investigated, criminalized, and prosecuted. So here I can finish. We put some recommendations, but we can discuss about that maybe with the colleagues.
Okay, thank you, Lena. And I'm glad that you were able to finish your presentation. And it's too bad that we did have that technical interruption. We'll now move to a question and answer period. Again, for those of you in the audience, please do send us your questions through the chat function. We have one from Felicitas Hillman in Berlin, which I would like to read out. And Gabriela, this is primarily directed to you, but I think that it could be something that all three of you might want to reflect on. So I will simply read Felicitas's contribution here. To quote, "Thank you for these exciting contributions. Now, Ms. Sanchez rightly mentioned the legal limbo migrants often live with. To avoid the terminology of smuggling, some scholars have established the concept of migrant industries. Don't you think this fits better? We see that often the migrants start from a legal situation and then are handled over via agencies that make use of legal lacunae, then fully illegal in the country of arrival. Migration is big business. Thus, it could be wise to get away from the criminalization and rather point to the interrelatedness of legal and illicit actions in order to be able to migrate." So any quick thoughts that you might have on that, Gabriela or Hara or Lena? But we'll start with Gabriela.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Hillman, for your question. First of all, yes, migration is a big business for all of us. If it wasn't a business, we would not be here. This is something that I think all of us have also that concern, right? Like we are all benefiting, one way or another from migrants by studying them. So I think this is a business for all of us. But when I'm actually a bit reluctant to accept the concept or the notion of the migration industry alone, because I think that it already takes out of all of this community context the very facilitation of mobility, which once again we try to see as a lot of the work that Lena, that Hara, and many other of our colleagues have been putting out together, shows how all of these community-based processes of mobility have become criminalized. They were not inherently criminal; they became criminalized. And in that process, when we just label them as an industry or as complex that if it would only, I think it eliminates all of this community ties, the very solidarity that that motivates migration many times, and also the facilitation, the very processes that we see that Lina was speaking about, on how people act because they want to help others. And, and this is, I know that this is for a completely, whole other event, but I also believe that even the people who charge money for, a lot of the services do it because they know and they are aware that mobility, that the kind of mobility that they are providing is a way to survive. So I also, many times, that notion that, that they are just doing it for the money, makes noise to me, precisely because of all of those community dimensions that bringing in the notion of an industry, almost immediately eliminates. Thank you.
Thank you. Hara or Lina, do either of you have something you would like to add to Gabriela's comments?
I would like to add that maybe there are a number of different approaches how this issue have been framed and studied, and I would like to maybe, in contrast, to offer some other views. For instance, researcher Landry has been writing about humanitarian smuggling, kind of out of humanitarian necessity, and also bringing back a bit also historical parallels of for instance, how smuggling has been the only way sometimes for certain targeted groups to escape. And then later in history, we celebrate those people as righteous ones and acknowledge their acts being such. Or in the other conference, we spoke about bringing this to kind of social disobedience narrative or theory, which is also very interesting. However, in my opinion, it at least distracts the fact that maybe states have act in disobedience with internationally agreed laws and norms that they themselves are supposed to provide, such as search and rescue, such as right asylum, such as no pushbacks, no non-refoulement, and then basically blaming those as disobedient, the ones who are actually upholding those internationally agreed norms and rights as some kind of marginal actors who are not supposed to do so. Of course, this all should highlight the role and agency of or some of those terrorists hide the role and agency of migrants themselves, and that actually many of those people who leave their countries, they from Gabriela's research and many others show that they are seen as actually enablers of their mobility and their life dreams, maybe their life trajectories as they envision it, and not some state governments envision by putting borders in between their dreams. So that's it, Hara.
Yes, I actually join as well Lina and Gabriela on this. I think through our conversations with Gabriela, what we notice now is the expansion of the concept of smuggling, that now it covers large activities, wider activities that before they have been just accepted and normal. If we take it in the context of Algeria, for instance, the border communities in the south, they used to transport seasonal migrants from the Sahel region to Algeria. And in informal way, this has been tolerated and part of the barter economy and of mitigating with the marginalization of the uncertainty and the economic conditions of the border communities. All of a sudden, with the externalization and the expansion of the smuggling concept, these people have become now criminals under this understanding of smuggling, although they just trying to mitigate with their marginalization and devastating economic conditions they are living under. And in my research as well, I focus on I try to bring the perspective of the migrant, how they perceive the smugglers. So, and there was very remarkable conversation with one of the Central African migrants where he was drawing parallels between the smuggler's job as facilitating their movement and the prophet Moses, how he crossed with the people who have been persecuted. Although he was like a victim of a fraud with some of the smugglers, but still they see and perceive the role of the smugglers as enabling them to reach safer spaces, to counter the punitive policies of the state that completely disregard their situation and not even provide legal pathways to movement.
Thank you, Hara, and thank you, Lena. I don't see other questions appearing on the screen yet, but what I can do is perhaps I can just raise a question of my own. You know, what we've been doing today is looking at some of the call them harmful consequences of the strict border enforcement that we've been talking about. But are we risking in this sort of conversation, are we risking forgetting about the actual harms that sometimes come to those people who employ or otherwise engage smugglers? And I'm thinking about what I referred to at the very beginning, when I gave, you know, the examples of the drownings in the Mediterranean or the deaths in the deserts separating Mexico and the United States, and so on and so forth. And this raises the question, like, just what are governments to do about this? Now, I also do believe, and I believe this sincerely, that nobody knows what to do about irregular migration. It's been an issue that has been, you know, raised for me during my entire time in the migration field, which is now well over 25 years. And I don't see any solutions looming. But what I do see is, I think, perhaps occasionally a degree of hysteria about the problem. But if we think about the actual harms that sometimes come to migrants, what is it that you three are saying that might impinge on the actual harms that migrants do experience? I know this is perhaps an unfair or very provocative question, but I will entertain any of your responses to this. In other words, our governments react. I mean, do governments not have a responsibility, or do international organizations like the UN not have a responsibility to protect migrants and perhaps even to respect, as the global compacts do, respect the sovereignty of borders? Gabriela, do you want to respond to my impertinent question?
No, I'm just what you were saying actually made me think about this hemispheric, I guess, encounter that just happened, gathering that happened last week for in the Americas, and the governments from the entire continent came together. They came to Los Angeles. They came together, trying to come up with new ideas about what had to be done in the Americas regarding migration. But it was there was a lot of. I wish there had been more criticism about the fact that the United States uninvited Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua from the from the gathering on the grounds that the countries are dictatorial, that they are not democratic nations. And then the United States also issued a series of I wouldn't necessarily call them commitments, but statements that were made about, the numbers of visas that could be that were going to be given to people primarily from Central America to travel to the US. Then also the commitments from private industries, among them Starbucks, to again foster legal, safely organized migration. And I was once again angered by how we only think of migrants as workers. That was the only way in which they are, they were defined in the context of the gathering, and also that the numbers of visas that were announced, or the compromises that were announced, are just a joke. When we think about the hundreds of people who have been waiting for the last 2 years to file their asylum claims on the Mexican side of the border, when we know of the millions of people from Haiti and Cuba and Venezuela who are leaving, their countries, and to talk about 2,000 visas for agricultural labor, is it's really an insult. So I don't really think that there is any kind of commitment or political will on the part of any of the governments in the Americas, and especially, in the case of the United States, to commit to see people and to see migrants in any other way other than workers. And again, the compromise, is also always forged at the expense of seeing or conceiving people as laborers. We are never seen as migrants, as people who may want to pursue other hopes and other goals other than labor. That was perhaps kind of like this very convoluted answer to what governments are doing. I don't see any commitments. I don't see any engagements really of countering smuggling, because again, we were just talking about, this is a business ultimately, and border control generates money, to governments. And so it's not, I don't really see a lot of commitment in that sense to contain migration or to create better conditions for migrants to the country.
Thanks very much, Gabriela. We do have one more question, which I will raise and invite Hara and Lina to respond to first, and Gabriela third. And then that will probably be the end of our time. So let me read out the question. It comes from Marua MJ. Hello, thanks for this interesting session. I am wondering why there are no initiatives by the United Nations to work on the immigration issue and to add it to the 17 objectives of sustainable development. Do you think this can be one solution? Hara, might you have some thoughts on this question, which concerns the role of the international community and the potential for development to solve the problem of irregular migration?
To be honest, I think it's the same, and it falls in the same what Gabriela said, that there is currently no political will to provide legal pathways to irregular migration, or because that will bring more discussions about I think the development in the origin countries. There will be a question of coloniality there, a question of race. A lot of questions will raise out of this in regularizing and sorting out the issue of migration. So, to be honest, no answer.
Sure, thank you. Lina, the European Union has for many years promoted economic development as a solution to irregular migration. Do you have any thoughts on how viable this might be?
I would add that maybe we should look not to SDGs agenda or Sustainable Development Agenda, but to Global Compact on Migration. And actually Objective 5 focuses on or calls governments to open more safe, orderly and regular routes. However, we see that this kind of objective has been the least taken up, or at least this is what I heard from civil society discussions in the reviews, that actually the appetite to open and broaden legal pathways both for migrants, be it family, be it work, be it studies or other purposes, it's not increasing, especially with the increasing xenophobic narratives, negative framing of migration, and so on. And same applies for JCR, or Global Compact on Refugees. While on the one hand, we speak about safe pathways, and they are seen as resettlement, and somehow there is good asylum seeker who waits long enough to be resettled, and bad asylum seeker who kind of takes his own agency or her own agency and initiative and crosses the sea or uses the fake document to actually arrive where there is maybe their family members. And here I would come back to another issue and evidence, especially from civil society organizations, that when we conducted interviews in Greece, we heard, for instance, that family members would apply for family reunification visas, especially when there would be members of asylum seekers and those of subsidiary protection, but there is narrow definition of who is family member, then they would not get those, or time periods would become too long. And for instance, parents of small children would just lose hope and would turn to so-called facilitators or smugglers to reunite their families, because for small children 1 or 2 years can be a long period of time. So we have these unresolved issues and these poisonous narratives within the EU that actually intentionally conflating, for instance, human trafficking and migrant smuggling and facilitation of migration as kind of, and compacting as kind of a same issue or same challenge that basically needs just to be combated. But we see that actually should, and this is not shared by all researchers, but should this EU law enforcement put higher focus on crimes of human trafficking, but there is a lot more clearer, use of violence, coercion, absence of consent on the side of migrants and refugees, then maybe we at least would stop criminalizing those acts that are a bit in the gray area and that are not, lack sometimes of this criminal definition. And I think maybe this could be a good starting point.
Okay, thanks, Lena. I want to give Gabriela a chance to reflect a bit on this potential of development as a solution to irregular migration. And I'll just note, Gabriela, that when the first North American Free Trade Agreement was developed, the American position included the hope that by enhancing or improving Mexico's economic status, that it would significantly reduce the need for Mexicans to migrate to the United States. Well, what happened there?
Really quick, because I only have 2 minutes. In fact, Mexican migration, US-bound Mexican migration has been on a decline, for maybe about the last 10 years or even more now. Most of the people who are arriving to the US are people from Central America. So the dynamics have changed, but it's not because of development. It's pretty much because of demographics. So, which is another, another element that we often forget. What the literature, when the evidence shows is that actually development fosters migration, especially in the case of, NAFTA. I think it enhanced all of this inequalities that existed, among all three countries that were part of it. And rather than, there was definitely an improvement in salaries in the Mexican economy. And this day, to this day, people from maybe my generation and younger do no longer feel inclined to migrate. And there's other opportunities for them. However, precarity, lack of jobs, the decreasing availability of medical services, and education are also shaping, other sorts of dynamics at the local level. So once again, development, or this notion of development, is not the solution, if there are no other elements to look closely at.
Right. Thank you very much. So before I turn back to Jan Roth for the closing remarks on this session, I just want to again thank Jan and Metropolis for hosting us today. It's been, I think, a very fascinating conversation about a difficult issue that, again, I do think that right now we don't have anything resembling a practical solution to. Thank you again to Gabriela for helping me out in putting this session together. Thanks to her as a speaker. Thanks to Lena and to Hara as speakers. I very much enjoyed your presentations. And thanks to the audience for joining us today. Jan, can I turn the microphone back to you?
Yes, you can. Well, let me join you in thanking the speakers and the audience, and also thanking you, Howard, for leading this interesting discussion. To be sure, the entire program has been recorded, and it will be available on our YouTube channel. I will send everyone an email with the details within 1 or 2 days. So I wish you a wonderful day or evening, and thank you so much. Good day.
Okay.